I've done many a trip to Sam's Club.
Yeah.
Emergency trip. Just grab a bowl of chips and water.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm gonna try to sip.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Williams Library. So if you didn't know, this building recently had a pretty major renovation. It was closed for a little while, so it reopened in April. So take a look around and enjoy this beautiful building if you have not had a chance to come in since the renovations. But also, welcome to the Six Bridges Book Festival. We're happy that you were able to join us today. And I want to encourage you to check out the rest of the Six Bridges sessions in addition to this one. So go to sixbridgesbookfestival.org. Make sure you look at what's happening through the rest of the week. The festival will be going on through Sunday, and we have Little Readers Rock on Sunday. We have a fundraiser featuring Ann Patchett and Robin Price Glasser. And then on Friday, so this week, we have a party that will be happening at the Ron Robinson Theater. So we encourage you to enjoy all that Six Bridges has to offer. And I want to make sure that I mention that Garbo Hearn with Pyramid Art Books and Custom Framing is in the back there. So or not really the back, kind of off to the side. So if you would like to buy a book, they are available for you here today. So Ayana and I actually had the pleasure of speaking yesterday at a Rotary Club meeting, and we had a great conversation, and that inspired some of the conversation that we're going to have today. But before we go too far into that, I should probably say who we are. So my name is Tamika Lee, and I am the Director of Communications and Community Engagement for CALS. And of course, this is Ayana Gray. She is a New York Times best-selling novelist whose critically acclaimed works have been translated into 11 languages across 5 continents. She has served as a guest lecturer for writing workshops across the country with focuses on world building, writing outside, lived experience. Originally, she's from Atlanta, but she's been in Arkansas for a long time now, so this is home. So welcome.
Thank you.
So we are going to go ahead and just jump right into this.
Let's do it.
So let's just talk a little bit about the book. Is there anything that you want to give people as sort of an overview of the story, or even just about yourself?
Sure. So hello, hi, thank you all for coming to hang out with me on a Wednesday. And I would be remiss, thank you so much to Central Arkansas Library System, CALS. Tamika mentioned I'm from Atlanta, but spent a lot of my childhood here, and specifically Terry Library was where I went after school, and it was my quiet place to go and calm down and read. And I'm just deeply appreciative that we have such an amazing library system here, because I've traveled a lot, and not everybody does have a robust and such an engaged library. So I appreciate CALS a lot. So the question I get a lot, what do you do? Oh, you're an author. And then I get asked, well, what are your books about? Are they on Amazon? Have I seen them? So the book that that people most know is Beasts of Prey. It was my debut, and it actually came out almost exactly 3 years ago today. So it was the 28th, almost exactly 3 years ago. It's young adult fantasy, and it's about 2 teenagers named Kofi and Ekon. Kofi is an indentured servant at a magical zoo with her mom. They're trying to pay down a debt to get away from the zoo. And Ekon, the boy, is a warrior in training. He comes from this long line of elite warriors. His big brother was a warrior, his dad was a warrior, and he's about to become a warrior. So very different kids. And then one night, through a series of unexpected events, I won't tell you what happens, you'll have to read to find out, but their paths cross, and they end up deciding to go together into this magical jungle to try to find a monster called the Shaitani. And they both want to find it for different reasons, but they go into this jungle with a plan, and you guys know how these big fantasy stories go. They go into this jungle and nothing goes according to plan, and there are other monsters, and there are other creatures, and there are secrets that neither of them know that they end up uncovering once they go into this jungle. And there are 2 more books in the series. It's a trilogy, it's complete, but the other books in that series kind of deal with the consequences of those secrets they find out about in book 1. I get asked a lot about age. 2 of my 3 grandmothers were retired librarians. They read, so I write books that they can read without having to have to talk to me later. So they're PG-13, I have readers ages 11 to 83, which I'm really blessed to have a nice wide age group of readers. And I'm trying to think, is there anything else?
I think you did.
Yeah, that's it.
So as a person who falls somewhere between 11 and 83, I won't
Sure.
tell you where, I also enjoyed the series of books quite a bit. So I was very happy when I had the chance to be the person who's moderating this session with you. So as you mentioned, this is the third book in the series.
Yes.
So how did you approach wrapping up this storyline? Of course, we don't want to get into any spoilers, but just how did you approach handling 3 books?
Well, something you and I've talked about this. When I started writing Beasts of Prey, the first book, I didn't know that this would be a series. I didn't know that I was actually allowed to write a series. I thought, no one knows who you are. You're just a kid from Arkansas. You better start small. And so I tried to write a really big first book. And then I got it in front of the man who's now my literary agent, and he said, I actually think this is more than one book. I think you're trying to do a little too much here. And I'm like, me, do too much? Talk to my mom. And so it was really cool, though, because he said that, and it kind of, for the first time, gave me permission to dream bigger. And I said, I think this could be a series, and that's what we ended up going to Penguin Random House, that's my publisher, and saying we would like to do the 3 books, and they said we think there's enough story for this to be 3 books. And so each book I write is kind of a time capsule of my life at that moment. I wrote Beasts of Prey, or I started Beasts of Prey fresh out of college when I was 22 and broke and trying to figure out my life. And so each experience of writing each book has been a little bit different. And when I wrote this book, I was back in Arkansas, here, married, and a little more confident in my ability as an author. And I knew, I've put Kofi and Akon, these 2, through quite a lot. I wanted them to have a happy ending, but I wanted that to feel very earned. This story is about kids running from real monsters and also figurative monsters. And so there's a point when you're running from the monsters where you have to stop, turn around, and face the monsters. So a lot of this is them facing those monsters they've been running from the whole series. And also learning, that they've built these communities in this series. They both have built communities of people who love them and accept them for who they are, not who they think they have to be. And so some of this is celebrating that community and saying, hey, I've grown up, I've changed a little bit from the start of the series to the end. And that's something, whether you're, 21, 31, 11, you're constantly evolving and finding your community and your people and your purpose. So, yeah.
So that's actually pretty interesting because in some ways it's almost like that found family. Like people talk about the fact that, your family is
chosen.
chosen.
Yeah.
So that's actually a really interesting part of the story.
Thank you.
You talked also about just evolution. So your own evolution, because you writing the first book, a little different than you writing the last book.
Yeah.
Did you feel at all that your characters sort of evolved with you, because of course they are going on a journey over the course of these 3 books?
Yeah, I think they naturally evolved because, again, who I was as a writer at one point is not who I am as a writer now. So they evolved, I think, very organically. I didn't want them to evolve too fast because, you grow a little, and this is real life, you grow a little bit in real life and then you have a setback, or you find yourself reverting back to, Ekon is someone who buries his problems. I don't know if anybody else can relate to that. You burying your problems. We all have been there where it's like, I know I'm burying the problem, I know I need to deal with it, but sometimes you still revert back to that. So both of them have moments in this series where they're evolving forward, then stepping back and having to think about it, and being aware of that, and then evolving a little further, step back a little, and you have that community of people who are pushing you forward when you do fall back a little bit. So they've evolved, I've evolved, it's been really kind of fun to look back now and see that, because you don't see it when you're actually in the books.
So there are a lot of pretty powerful, themes in the book, dealing with power structures, identity, responsibility, once again, just sort of learning yourself. How would you say these themes, once again, that they even evolved over the course of the series, and not just evolved, was that also a part of your thinking when you were going into it, that you wanted to focus on those for just to help build that metaphor?
Yeah, I think they were a lot of the themes you're talking about were there, and I deliberately put some things in this book very consciously, including having a black boy on the cover, because that was something I had to fight for. I can talk more about that too if y'all want.
We're going to.
But I tried to be really conscientious about it. I think one thing again, didn't realize it till later, but I started I'm very proud of Beasts of Prey, but I was definitely more careful with Beasts of Prey. We live currently in a society that where some corners of the society are supporting book banning. And the reality is that writers who come from more marginalized backgrounds tend to be banned more. You see it all the time statistically, and so I was kind of like, I don't want my books to get banned. I better, make sure I don't put anything too edgy in. And again, part of it was my grandma's, but I think I was like less afraid with each book to be a little more pronounced and a little more intentional and bold about some of the themes that I was talking about. Because the thing is, like, Ekon, the boy character in the story, he has OCD, he has anxiety, and I alluded to it, but I didn't address it directly on the page in books 1 or books 2. In book 2. In book 3, he actually has a conversation with somebody who it kind of asks him about how he has lived his whole life with these things and how he feels and how he deals with it. So that's what I mean. Like, it was there, but bringing it out more. And that was part of my editor encouraging me to do so, readers saying, this meant a lot to me that you did this because I have OCD, I have anxiety, and I saw myself on the page when you did that. That kind of stuff really empowered me to really to dig in more.
Yeah. Have you heard that kind of feedback from a lot of people, even if it wasn't necessarily about the anxiety, but other things? Like we talked yesterday, and grief was one of the themes, and one of these emotions that people are grappling with that you mentioned. Have you heard a lot of feedback from people that these are things that they did pick up on, that they resonated with them, or they helped them in some way as they read the books?
Yep. So a lot of feedback about the anxiety, and also stimming. For those of you who might be familiar, Ekon stims and counts, and that's part of his coping. I was surprised by the different people, adults and kids specifically resonating with that. There are moments when some of the characters, one of the characters has wash day, especially for girls of color in the room who understand the trauma of wash day and having to spend hours washing your hair, and it's such a laborious task. There were girls who were like, I understood that reference. I remember there was a girl who messaged me on Instagram and her name was Ayana, and she'd never seen an Ayana on a book cover before. I never thought about that mattering, but even the idea of other Ayanas out in the universe being oh, I'm allowed to tell stories too, and I've never seen that. So some of it was stuff that I hoped people would see, and some of it was stuff that I didn't realize people would pick up on and that would resonate with them. And again, it's not just kids, it's people who maybe were not allowed to read certain books as kids, who are kind of refinding their childhoods as adults.
So you mentioned already the how intentional you were about the book cover and even the way that you initially told the story, because you wanted to be careful. Did you have any type of pushback or questions regarding your story when you decided to go the fantasy route? Because that's not necessarily something that you see a lot of Black characters, or maybe even other characters of color. So was that also just a part of your journey with getting the book published?
A little bit. I'm so lucky. My editor is a Black woman, and part of the reason I ended up with her was because she picked up on references that none of the other editors who I was talking to understood. And so I had a really supportive team. She understood what I was trying to do, and she was very protective of me. I think sometimes people wanted to kind of push Beasts of Prey and call it an issue book. So this is a book that, and not it's an issue as in it's tackling some sort of social issue. So this is a story about racism or social justice. And I do think those books are relevant and have a place, but I don't think that especially Black kids should only have to read books about social justice and overcoming racism. I think Black kids should be allowed to have magical adventures, and they overcome things, but racism is not one of them. And so I had to kind of push gently sometimes and say, when they do those, here's the books to read during Black History Month, and here are 10 issue books you should be reading. I'm like, wait a minute, my book's not an issue book or a social justice book, it's a fantasy. It's just an epic fantasy story. And so a little bit of that, and also with Ekon, because YA fantasy has been so female dominated, when they were showing me the sketches, the early sketches for Beasts of Prey, a lot of them were just Kofi, and I had to say no. Half of this, literally 50% of the story is told through Ekon's point of view, he matters.
Yeah, they're like co-leads.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah.
And I didn't have to push too hard, but I did have to correct that at first because they were like, oh, well, we see, or even the title, like there were some titles that focused on Kofi, and I had to say, no, the title needs to reflect them both. And I think once I started saying it consistently, you know, my publisher, they got on board, but there was that instinct to lean toward just the girl and not highlight the boy.
Yeah. So that's interesting. I am not a person who typically reads a lot of fantasy. I think your trilogy is the first like fantasy book that I have probably gone all the way through. And let me tell you, I binge read it. Like I was up late at night, you know, like a little kid, flashlight, like trying to, you know, get through the book. But I never thought about it from that perspective of, in this genre, it's so female, like oriented, I guess, or like that those characters are the dominant characters. Because initially I was thinking, well, was that very intentional on your part too, to making sure that she had a sense of agency? But to an extent, it sounds like you had to be very intentional about making sure he was a fully fleshed out character.
And there were editors who were like, he's not tough enough, you know, and that was a deliberate choice. I feel especially that boys, and especially black boys, are pushed to be tough, hyper tough and aggressive in their interest. You need to like football, and you need to like the contact sport. And to be clear, I love football. If you like, let me just say, I love sports. So there's nothing wrong with it. But what I always talk about, if you've come to one of my events, you've probably heard me talk about my brother Corey. My baby brother, who's now over 6 feet tall. My brother is a little kid. He was the kid in the Thomas the Tank Engine overalls. He liked doing puzzles. He liked to read. He was this quiet, gentle little black boy. And when he went to school, I watched the way he was perceived and immediately assumed to be rambunctious and a problem and loud and all these adjectives that were not accurate. They just weren't accurate. I was like, look, my brother's annoying, but he's not rambunctious, like, you know. And so I wanted to create a boy character for kids like, or for boys like Corey, and not just black boys, but the boys that like math, the boys that like to read, the boys that would rather be kind of quietly drawing in their room as opposed to like necessarily like out in the dirt, you know. Because there are a lot of stories for boys that want to get like dirty and in the mud. There are movies, we've all heard of 300 and Gladiator and all these super like macho movies. Not as much space for the boys that aren't like that. And they exist, I know they exist. And we're seeing declines in young boys reading, and it's because they're not seeing themselves in stories, and they think, well, I don't belong in them, so why should I be reading them? I'll just go play computer games. So, I mean, we can't complain about that and then not create things for them to read. So,
yeah. Good point. So, of course, the characters are, you know, a huge part of this, you know, their dynamic, and we've already talked a bit about Kofi and Ekon and just their relationship. I'm actually just curious to know, like, how you went about developing that, because as I was reading it, I know it's not a romance book by any stretch of the imagination, but there's that little bit of, you know, sort of will they, won't they? So can you talk about that dynamic a little bit?
Well, so I'm a millennial. I had Twilight and the last Harry Potter books. You know, YA was really big for me as a teenager, and I was very lucky for YA to be big while I was a young adult. But something that I didn't realize impacted me till I was older was, if you all have heard of instant love, where the characters meet on page 12 and by page 30 they're like ready to die for each other, and you normalize that. Like, but as a teenager you're like, oh well,
this is how it should be.
Yeah, and it's funny until you get into a situation where you're like, say, dating someone and you're making excuses for them because you're like, well, they're my person for life in the universe and whatever, and you actually put these really kind of toxic ideas into kids' heads about what love is and what's realistic and normal. And it really annoyed me as I got older and looked back and realized like I created some things in my head and like normalized things because of books that really were not normal expectations. And so Kofi and Ekon, there is romance in this book. It's PG-13, but
it's very sweet.
Yeah, it's grandma approved. But you know, there's literally a moment where Ekon's like, I'm not in love with her because I just met her, but I really, really like her, and I'm kind of figuring out how to deal with that feeling. But he's not like, I'm in love with her and I'm ready to die, because that's ridiculous. And also, nobody's first kiss is perfect, and so they have an awkward first kiss. It's kind of like figuring what's going on, because it's not like that in real life, and we all know that. So I wanted to be as much as I could, authentic to what it is like to be a real teenager.
So tell us about this world that you've created, which being able to stretch that across, 3 books. I know you have editors and people who help you with that, but just your inspiration for the world and, just that process for making sure that you did keep it consistent across all 3 books.
Yeah, so I should have probably led with it too. This story is Pan-African inspired. I say Pan-African on purpose because I pulled from different parts of the African continent. I do not know where my ancestors came from specifically, so I decided to honor the continent and pull from West Africa, Central Africa, Southern, Eastern. It's truly Pan-African. And I had the chance to go to Ghana when I was in college, full scholarship, thank you, University of Arkansas. And I remember going and being like, this country is, if you all get the chance to go to Ghana, it's a beautiful country. You've got beaches in the south, white sand beaches. You've got the tip of the Sahara Desert in the north. You've got lush jungles with wild elephants just popping up, and they're really quiet, so you're just there and suddenly there's an elephant and suddenly there's a baboon stealing your lunch, and like it's just this, and then there's a mosque that was built in the 1100s, I believe, that's still there in Larambanga. There's so much history in Ghana, and I remember being there and being like, why are there not more fantasy novels set in worlds that look like this? We see a lot in like kind of England, Middle England, middle-aged England inspired and a lot of European inspired, but this place has so much magic too. And I remember asking myself kind of, why am I not seeing more? But I do have to give a plug because it's a Pan-African inspired book. I always tell people though that my books are Arkansas books because, and then people are like, how do you make that connection? And he's actually here, I don't know where he is, but one of my teachers from high school, Mr. Toppich, he actually connected me with professors at the University of Arkansas, which is where I went to school, who then encouraged me to add to my major, who encouraged me to study abroad. And I had a lot of really good people pushing me and shaping me here in Arkansas to do this. And it's kind of like the butterfly effect where one person did something for you, another person that they connected you to did something else for you that allowed me to go to Ghana, that allowed me to start thinking about, hey, I want to write a fantasy series that pulls from this place. So it was Arkansans who looked after me that allowed this and this whole thing, me being an author, to happen. So I give so many thanks to those Arkansans.
Yeah. So are there little nuggets of Arkansas in the book? Is there anything that you would point to and say, yes, I had a memory or a place that I visited or something that you can actually see it in the book? Or is it just overall about your experience with the people that you're yes, that's what helps to make it in Arkansas?
It's the people. I didn't pull too much from, say, Fayetteville, at least not in this book. Definitely Ekon has mentors, and his relationship with his mentors is similar to my relationship with some of my mentors. There is a reference to my sorority, actually, in book 1. It's very small, but some of my sorority sisters have caught it, so.
Okay.
I put tiny Easter eggs in my books, and it's sort of fun because if you see it and you catch it, it's fun, but you don't have to catch it to appreciate the story. I just think that's fun.
Right. So as far as just your inspiration for storytelling, whether it's a person, a landscape, or even just a gap in available content, do you think pulling inspiration from something like that is sort of essential in some ways to storytelling?
I think you can't help but put pieces of yourself in a book, and you don't always realize you're doing it in that moment. And then after you finish the book and you're looking at the whole thing, you're like, oh, that actually was really personal, or that was actually me working through something. There's a scene, I don't think it's a spoiler, where Kofi has a moment to speak with her ancestors. Because I'll tell you, actually writing a book that pulled from African folklore was really tough at times because I got really angry and frustrated that I didn't know where my ancestors were from.
Yeah.
I knew approximately, but I was I have friends who can trace their family tree 11 generations back. They know exactly, my spouse knows exactly where in England his family is from, and I don't. And it was really frustrating, and the way certain mythology is preserved, the way, you know, millions of dollars are put into preserving certain parts, certain countries' cultures, and then you don't see that funding and that preservation always on the African continent. Really, really angering and frustrating at times. But there's a scene where Kofi is sitting. She has like a brief time where she can sit with her ancestors and they can see her and she can look around and be surrounded by them. And that was something that I've always been like, if I could have an hour just with all of my foremothers, what would that be like? And I'll never necessarily have that, but I got to write it. So it was very cathartic, and I got to put that little personal bit of myself into a fantasy novel.
When you had those thoughts, did you actually think like, okay, what would I ask if I had a chance to?
Yeah,
to
like
talk
just
to
what
them?
would it be like? What are the things that I wish I could hear? And I think the thing actually that I would want to hear is, we're with you. Even if you can't see us, we're with you, we're a part of you, and you're not alone. And so getting to like write that out for Kofi got to have that. That was really meaningful.
Yeah. So would you consider the setting like a character in the story?
Yeah.
And the reason I ask that is because we talked a lot about, of course, just the world building, but it's really interesting how much the actual environment plays a role in this story. I mean, there are like trees coming alive, and of course there's all these animals and just all these mystical beings. So would you consider your setting actually a character?
Yeah, not on purpose, but yes. Like, and telling you, so much of it's subconscious, but you know, Kofi and Ekon go into this huge jungle, and one of the things that Kofi and Ekon learn is respecting their environment and not taking without asking for permission. So, you know, and it kind of, like the things that the jungle does to them sort of shape the story, and it's holding secrets, and they kind of have to earn the right to uncover those secrets. So the Greater Jungle is one of my favorite things to write.
Yeah. So actually, let's talk about just you a little bit.
Okay.
I mean, you talked about your Arkansas ties and the people who have been that support system for you. How would you say that your background in some ways shaped your writing, whether it's the style or the story that you created?
Yeah. So there's a quote you may have heard. I'm going to kind of not remix it, but synthesize it. So Toni Morrison had the quote, "If you're looking for a book and you can't find it, you have to write it." I think as a kid, like I was looking for certain books on the shelf and not finding them. So, and I'm sorry, you heard me say it the other day, but like I remember going to a library and being like, okay, I can either have the book with a black girl on it or a black kid, and it's going to be an issue book, or it's going to be a book set in the civil rights era, and it's probably going to make me a little sad. Or I can have this epic, cool dragons and whatever, but I'm not going to see anyone like me. I just know I'm not. And I accepted it. I was just like, I just got to choose, and I would choose. And it got to a point where, you know, I decided I didn't want to choose anymore. And I'm not the only Black fantasy author, to be clear. I'm so proud to have added to this beautiful canon that's growing now. But as a kid in the 90s and the 2000s, it wasn't there. And it wasn't accessible, even if it was there. And so that's something like I'm very conscious of in my writing, and something that I try to do is remember like that kid that was looking for those books and couldn't find them.
Yeah. And the escapism, I think, is really an important aspect. Like you, I've thought that before when you're reading books, how much of it is tied to, like you said, some kind of like, you know, like Black trauma. And I'm sure that, you know, Black people are not the only people who feel this way. I'm sure there are other people of color, people who are also like diverse, you know, in other ways, also feeling like, okay, anytime there's a story that is about me,
it's struggle.
It's a struggle.
Or being a woman, and it's like reading only books where women struggle. Reading books for only someone who's disabled is struggling with their disability. It's like people are have more dimension than that.
Yes, and so there was something really nice about actually just being able to escape into the books without having all these extra layers that that I could really appreciate.
Thank you.
And so as far as your support systems, you've talked quite a bit about that, and you said that you wanted your book to be one that, you know, grandmother could read, and, you know, nobody had to feel embarrassed. For people who are interested in writing but maybe don't have that kind of support system, do you have any advice for them for like finding their circle?
I think there are some really great communities here in Little Rock. Like I know on like looking on Facebook or Googling Little Rock writers groups, there are some really great writers here in town who meet up in their communities. I think going like we're in the middle of Six Bridges, like there are book people here. So literally and saying, okay, people who have similar interests to me, if they like books, maybe they want to talk about writing books. Like I think going, like finding those environments too helps. Yeah.
So something else that you recently told me about the books, because we know that these are YA, and so they have a bit of a younger audience. I mean, you don't have to be super young, you know, to enjoy them, but there is that little bit of a younger audience.
Yeah.
So there is a Spotify playlist that goes along with this. Now, is that actually a list that you curated yourself? You want to talk about this list a little bit?
Sure. My publisher asked me, they said, well, were there any songs that inspired you? And I'm like, were there? So I think you can probably search it if you have Spotify, or even if you don't, you could probably just like on the internet, like it's there. I have playlists for each book and the songs that kind of inspired and that made me think about it. I write in silence. When I'm actually writing, it's in silence. But when I'm going on walks and trying to think through an action scene or a really intense scene, you know, there's music playing in the background and I'm picturing it like a music video in my head. And so some of the songs you're like, oh, I totally understand that. And then some of them you're like, why did she do that? But I mean, it's just like kind of an insight into like kind of the creative process. And I know a lot of authors who do that.
Yeah. So were you saying that, you know, these songs help to inspire the words, or they're songs that after you finished, you were like, okay, I think these songs relate to some things in the book? Not
the words and not always the lyrics, but sometimes like, you know, sometimes it's the beat, like this really frantic, nervous beat, and I'm like, that's how Ekon is feeling right now in the middle of being really anxious. It's the beat, it's the like physical, like the feeling. Sometimes the lyrics encompass an emotion, so I'm not taking the lyrics from the song, not copywriting, but sometimes it's the tone and the emotion. And I listen to a lot of, if you all know Hans Zimmer, he's a composer. He composed the Lion King soundtrack, if you've ever heard that really beautiful soundtrack. Hans Zimmer's one of my favorite composers, so he does a lot of beautiful music that doesn't have words, but it makes you feel something. And so there's a lot of Hans Zimmer in those playlists.
So for teens who are, I don't know if we have really any in here, but is that something that's always on your mind as you are writing? I mean, I know you have like future projects.
The music?
Or just that audience, because of course these books are YA. Is that something that is just like a genre that you think that you would like to stay in, like writing books that do have that age range from like teens to like young adults?
Yeah. People have the misconception, unfortunately, that the younger the age group, the easier it is, and I actually think it's the opposite. Like, picture book writers are the most talented writers in the world, if you think about it, because you're having to convey a lot with very few words and very limited vocabulary. And so YA is hard too, in the sense that you don't want to talk down to your readers like teens. I hated being talked down to as a teenager. You want to make sure, understand that you have a tremendous impression and a tremendous power. There are some teens who've never read a story with a black boy or black girl as the main character, and they're going to create their own conceptions based on your book. I told you I did this as a teenager. I normalized and formed opinions about the world based on what I was reading. So there's a tremendous responsibility when you're writing YA. I think I always will, because I really, really enjoy like what YA does. These are stories about finding your place in the world, and that's really beautiful. But I always want to do it responsibly and with purpose. I don't want to just, I think I'll just throw in a character called this and a character called that. I want to be really, really deliberate and intentional whenever I'm writing YA.
So I didn't ask you earlier about if there's a particular character that you see yourself in the most. We talked overall about the characters and just how they developed, and your intention behind Ekon and Kofi and the way you approach them. But is there a character that you feel most closely resembles you?
I think I've put myself in all of them a little bit, but I actually relate to Ekon the most. there's a scene where like Kofi and I kind of have a plan, and they're like, we're gonna do this, and then it falls apart, and he's panicking, like he's like, oh my gosh, and Kofi's like, so what? It's fine, and he's like, no, we had a plan, and I was writing it, and then I stopped, and I was like, you're writing yourself, because like I'm the kid that gets to the airport 3 hours early, like. I like a plan, I like an itinerary, I get very like panicked and anxious when we're off the itinerary. My spouse, some of my siblings are kind of like, you know, so I relate to Ekon the most, and he's also a reader and likes quiet and calm and order, and that's me.
Okay. So there's a lot of just action in the book. How did you balance that action with the character development?
I think something that a writer said to me once is your characters are allowed to have, your characters are allowed to have quiet moments. So if I had like a big action scene, I would try to balance that with like a contemplative moment, like let me calm down and think about what just happened. And I also like with action scenes, I would get up and move around and try to like choreograph it myself.
I wish I could see that. Like that sounds.
No, you don't.
That sounds great.
But that's like I would be in it, like trying to picture. Okay, if I've like got a sword, like, and I go like this, you know, what does that look like? What does that feel like? Yeah. I really put myself into the world, and that's why like my husband will walk in, and I'm like, go away, I'm choreographing. And he's like, okay, in my office, and like, but that's how I'm able to relate to it, and like by literally putting myself in the middle of the jungle and saying, okay, what would I be feeling? What would I be smelling? What would I be like? What would it look like? What would, like, you know, is there a bug crawling on me? Like that's how I'm able to, I think, relate to readers and bring them into it by getting down to the little details.
Is that something that you would encourage other people to do? Because hearing you describe it, it's very interesting because just thinking, okay, you really are having to see it so you can put it on paper. So I guess how did you get yourself into that space, and how would you encourage other people to get into that space?
It didn't happen overnight. I have great critique partners. I remember my agent, he's a really interesting person, and he's a weather person. Like, you guys know those people that like just watch the Weather Channel for fun?
At first I wasn't sure what you meant. I was like, wait, like he's a weatherman?
Weather.
He's a meteorologist?
He genuinely, like he just has an interest in weather. And I remember he would read my stuff and ask, what's the weather? And I was like, why does he keep asking? But I'm like, oh, you can actually do a lot with weather. Think about the way a gloomy, like, fall, autumn afternoon with gray skies and a crisp air. Think about the tone and the mood that sets. Think about, like, you know, so many horror movies, it was a dark and stormy night, lightning cracks, like weather and environment can actually, and then what are the smells? What does rain smell like? What does a summer day smell like to you? Do you smell suntan lotion and sea air, sea salt air? Not in Arkansas. You know, maybe lake, maybe like at the lake, like, but that's actually the thing. Like, when I give critiques, sometimes I'll do critiques and workshops. I'll ask and say, hey, you said this is set in the South. Florida South is different from Arkansas South, seriously.
It is.
And I'll press the writer and say, get specific with me, because, you know, I have friends who've written stories set in Arkansas and they make specific references that mean something when an Arkansan reads it, or they can say, that's not realistic. So getting really specific with your environment and tapping into all those sensory cues, or like leaning into a certain sensory cue, like really focusing on the smell. Yeah. You all know those like childhood smells that as soon as you smell something, you're back to being a kid. Or you taste something and you're back to being a kid. Or it can be a negative thing where like you smell a certain perfume and you're triggered because you worked with somebody who wore that perfume and they were awful. Like, you can use those sensory cues in so many ways to bring the reader in and evoke emotion. So I've kind of been taught that over time, to really think about all the ways you can use that to bring the reader in.
Awesome. So I'm going to open this up before long for questions, but I want to see if you just have any sort of like parting words before we open up for questions.
I get asked about advice. I don't know if anyone's going to ask that, but my advice is read and then read more and then read more. We are so lucky, again, I said it, but to have such a wonderful library system here in Central Arkansas where we can just go, and not just books, but especially books. We can borrow books. We can use the Libby app on our phones if you can't get to the library. I don't have a degree in creative writing, and the lessons I learned, the best lessons I learned, were just from reading a lot and kind of immersing myself. So read, find people in your corner to encourage you, not just reading and writing, but like if you have a hobby or something that you say, I've always wanted to do it, but I've never gotten around to it, find people that encourage you to do it and believe that you can do it. Because on the days when I'm like, oh, my books aren't very good, I'm not a very good writer, I have friends who are like, stop being silly, Ayana, and get back to work, like lovingly, but they're like, we know you can do this. We know that you're talented and you should keep going. And I lean on those people on the tough days. So community and keep reading.
So it sounds like I also need to get you to record something for us that says, oh, we have the Libby app and all these things.
I love the Libby app.
Because like, okay, so you're thinking in, your sounds and you're choreographing. I think in pictures and marketing pitches. So yeah, it sounds like, we need to get together again.
Yeah.
So at this point, I'll go ahead and open it up and see if anybody has any questions.
I have a question for you.
Hello.
Being the genre that you're in, how in the world
I might
did you
need to
come up with
repeat it.
such dynamic names and the places and the characters and the fictional, how in the world?
Did everybody hear what she asked? Okay.
The names, thank you for asking. So a lot of the names actually draw especially from West Africa, or sometimes they're like, I'll take a translation. I used a lot of Swahili because my name is Swahili. I do not speak Swahili, but my parents gave me a Swahili name. And I'll take it, and you'll see this in other fantasy authors, they'll take like Old English and slightly twist words around, or they'll take Spanish or another language. So I did that a lot. My name's Ayana, and there are other Ayanas, but as a kid it was like, I'd go to Chick-fil-A and they'd call my names and be like, A something, and like, and it's funny, but it's also like as a kid it kind of internalizes this thing, oh, just call me A. Like you end up diminishing yourself a little, so I wanted all those kids who have the unusual names to get to see themselves, because Kofi and Ekon are both pretty common names in West Africa, but not here. Like some of the names have like real meaning, like Kamau meaning warrior, and that fits because that's Ekon's older brother, he is a warrior. So I wanted to kind of pay tribute to names that are not as common here, but are more common in other parts of the world, and that we just don't see in fantasy a lot. Yeah.
And the preacher names?
Oh, those are all real. These are all like drawn from real mythology in different parts of Africa. So those are their names, which is kind of fun because people think that I invented them, and I'm like, nope. We all know about like Pegasus, the horse with wings, and we've heard of the Minotaur. Like that's all very common knowledge to us. But there are myths and fables and tales specifically from like the Congo, specifically from Benin, specifically from South Africa, that aren't as well known. And so I wanted more people to hear those stories too.
So just following up on that, do you have any like web source or in your Kindle options of versions of these books, do you have links to those fables, to those myths that you used?
There are author's notes at the back of each book that explain the pronunciations and the choices that what I pulled from and what part of Africa I pulled from. Because I thought I was that kid that wanted to know more, so I just put it in the back of the book, in the author's note.
So I was curious as to what spurred the change in the covers. Because I actually have
The
original cover with the flowers and then the new one. And so I was wondering what caused that change.
Yeah, I think it was my publisher getting more behind me. So they had, if you all have seen the cover, it's black with a snake and leaves. That's the OG cover. And I really wanted it to be clear that I was writing these books unapologetically with black kids in the center. And my editor supported it and said, let's do it. Let's put them right on the cover, in a way where it's really, really clear. And I appreciated that. So I wanted, eventually I'm hoping I can get the hardcover of Beasts of Prey to match, but the paperback of Beasts of Prey has their faces and so they match in that way. But that was really why I felt like it wasn't clear enough who was centered at this story.
And I know we're in audience questions, but that is interesting though, just thinking about the name piece, because like we had that conversation like about people not knowing how to pronounce your name, and to me it felt like second nature to say Ayana.
I've gotten it all.
Yeah, and I mean, because I've had that issue a few times with my name. I mean, usually people know how to say it, but like when I'm speaking it into my iPhone or, you know, like other people say my name, they have to say, call Tamika. It won't pick it up saying Tamika. So it is interesting just the way how certain things are they're sort of second nature to you based on, you know, your culture,
What you've
your
grown up
background,
with.
what you've grown up with.
And so like I have kids, I'll go to schools and sign books and I'll personalize them, and some kid will be like, you can just call me that. I said, what does your mom call you? And then, you know, they'll tell me and then I'll repeat it back and they're like, you said it right. And I'm like, yeah, it's your name. It is the most personal thing about you. The least I can do in this 2-second interaction is say your name correctly, the name your parents gave you. That is one of the few things you will keep your whole life. It's your name. And so like it's I guess a good, bad thing in that because my name has not always been said or spelled right, I take extra care too.
Wait, she writes and she can do math.
Not according to my accountant, but you know, I think it's good. Like it's in the, you know, sometimes when you have hard things happen, it actually is in a good. It ends up being good in that it makes you more compassionate to someone else.
Yeah.
So.
I was wondering, in that you created this world that's we've never seen before, how did you know when you were done? How did you know when it was ready to go and time to put it out there?
The honest answer, my editor called me at 4 o'clock and said, Ayana, it's going to the printer. You have to send it to me right now. Because I could have kept, well, with Beasts of Prey specifically, because I was just like, but it's not perfect. But I want to, and she was like, you have to let it go. You have to let it go.
An editor or you
So my editor, I'm not my editor, sorry. I wrote it, I sent it to different agents. Some of them said yes, some of them said no. The one that said yes said, I want to work on this a little more with you. We worked on it together. And he said, I want to address like 1, 2, and 3 here. And then we took it out more, and like lots of rounds of edits. I think I'm somebody who plots. Like I plot my whole story out before I start writing, so I have an outline that I'm working off. I'm not just like, they call them pantsers, writing by the seat of their pants. I'm not that kind of writer. I have to have a plan, and so when I get to the end of my outline, unless it doesn't feel right, I'll stop. But just because I've told the whole story doesn't mean that I feel like it's truly done. Like I'm like, I could add more in the front, I could expand this, I could cut that, that's probably too long. That's the stuff that I was tinkering with when my editor said, you have to stop. Like, but because I outline, I know beginning, middle, end, you know. Yeah.
Did you know that for the whole arc? Like, did you know from the beginning how the 3rd book would end?
I knew how the 3rd would end. There were some parts in the middle, like getting there, that I wasn't exactly sure of. And there were some times when I plotted it, then when it came time to write it, it didn't feel good. So I had to go back and re-plot it again. And that was really frustrating. But it's part of writing. Sometimes you have to write the ugly, bad thing first. And they call it the ugly drafts, the 0 drafts. You have to write the bad one first, let yourself get the whole story out, and then go back and make it better. Because a blank page, you can't do anything with it. But if you have even the worst draft ever, that's still something that you can take and make it better. So.
And was it determined to, like, where each book, I guess, would end? Like, how was it decided this is where Beast of Prey will be, this is Beast of Ruin, this is Beast of War?
The first chapter of Beasts of Ruin used to be the last chapter of Beasts of Prey, actually. And my editor said, that's too much of a cliffhanger, move it to book 2. So, and that's where like having you can't do it all by yourself. Somebody has to objectively, who's not so close, to look at it and say, I think this is actually the beginning of the next book rather than the end of the first. So, yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, did you have another?
Was it difficult trusting someone with those kind of decisions and that kind of input after you've lived it and done it? And I mean, I'm curious.
It's a little bit, but like I said, I keep pointing to this one, but I had Easter eggs in Beasts of Prey, and I was very fortunate that I had 11 editors who wanted this book at one point, which is
amazing.
It was overwhelming. But she was the only one who caught certain references, and I'm like, okay, she read this the way I wanted it to be read, and that helped me trust her to know like she sees what I'm trying to do with this book. So that helped. It's still scary, but when you know somebody sees you and sees your art the way you intended it to be, that makes it easier. Yeah.
Hey.
Hi.
So I, first of all, used to be a middle school teacher in a
Thank you.
minority school.
Yep.
So those types of books are, it was so nice when I could point to a book and be like,
Here you go.
be yourself.
Yeah.
So that really resonated with me, your comments about how, you had to choose one or the other. You can have the genre you want, or you can have the representation. So kudos to you on that.
Thank you.
I've actually got 2 questions.
Okay.
I'm also the one that does too much. But number one, and you can answer this one last if it leads into something else, but I just wanted to know what was next for you on the horizon. If you're planning to stay with YA, or, if you wanted to expand to something else. I was just curious if you wanted to share. If you don't, that's okay too.
What's your other question?
Huh?
What's your other question?
Yeah, you can just pretend that I didn't ask you.
I can answer it. I'll answer it though.
But I really liked what you said about wanting to be able to write a book that they can enjoy. That doesn't have to be an issue book. But I also am wondering if your position on worrying if your book was going to get banned, if that has changed, like now that you've gotten more confident with your writing. I know that some authors take it as a badge of honor, like, my book got banned.
Yeah.
I'm doing great. So I wondered if that had changed for you now that you got a little bit of courage behind you, I guess.
I'm less afraid of it. I don't think that my books have been banned yet. That's not even wood, but I knocked on it anyway. I haven't been banned yet to my knowledge. Excuse me. I'm quite sure it'll happen, and I'll be miffed about it. I'm so vehemently against banned books. It makes me really mad, actually, because I had a pretty, not strict, she wasn't super, my mom was not very strict, but the thing is, I would bring her books home from the library, like a stack, and my mom would be like, let me see them. And she would just say, yeah, this one's too old for you. Come back to it in a few years. She was a parent, but she never was like, I want to take this book away from the entire library and prevent anybody else from reading it. And so, everyone, I think my mom's amazing, but I'm like, I've never understood that impulse to say, well, I don't want this for my family or my kids, so no one should have it. I just think it's so backwards and regressive.
My only disciplinary event as a teacher was, a parent speaking out against a book that I had in the classroom library.
And the teachers and the librarians in the state of Arkansas are fighting like heck, and I commend them all the way up to the state level, doing everything they can, and I'm so, so proud. The proudest moments I'm an Arkansan are when I see what our educators do to push back and say, no, our students and our communities deserve more. So we are so lucky to have so many strong people in this state fighting. On that note, switching just for a second while I'm fired up. Yeah. So I'm not as afraid anymore. I think it hasn't happened. It may happen. I'm not afraid of it anymore. I will get to talk about my 4th book on October 10th. And I have had to wait for 10 months because my editors couldn't finalize a title. I had to come up with 5 different titles before we landed on this one, and we couldn't announce it until the title was confirmed. So I have written my 4th book, I'm working on my 5th book, and then I have a 6th and 7th that I have not touched. So that's the life of an author. I'm always thinking 2 years out from real life. So I'm thinking about fall 2025 and spring 2026, and then I still have 2 more books coming out in 2027 and 2028 that I have not even started page 1. Yeah.
It's good that you're a planner like Econ, because that's a lot.
I still want to write in YA. I may write in other spaces too, because I never want to do the same thing twice. But if you all are on Instagram or Facebook, October 10th, I will get to announce it.
Mine isn't a question, mine is more a statement. Mostly thank you. I'm
Oh.
27 and I never got into sci-fi or fantasy
Yeah.
until this year because there wasn't any representation back then. I mean, the first one I read this year was actually Children of Blood and Bone.
Yeah, Tony Adeyemi.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's into that, and I saw your book on TikTok actually.
Ooh.
Me too. And then, my surprise when I found out she lived here. So. And
See-
I was like, okay, I'm gonna try this. And I love that it's not centered around Black trauma because I want to read to escape. Like I live that life every day. I don't have to go into.
Yeah,
it to
exactly.
read that. So thank you.
Turn on the news. I mean, like it's a nice break.
Yeah.
So I thank you for saying that. When you're in your office or you're doing the work by yourself, you're like, oh, this doesn't matter. No one's gonna see it. And so like, thank you for saying that because it's a reminder that it does matter and I do get to connect to people. So.
Oh, I was saying, that's my mother right there, also an educator.
When she said it about her name, the first time I heard it, when I was saying, well, call Tamika, the thing did not understand what I was saying. She said, call Tamika. She was like, yeah, so when she said that, that's what it. And she has a sister named Aisha, so that's always been.
Oh, yeah.
She's 40-something, and you didn't hear that.
Now, don't put her out there like that.
But that's I have a cousin named Aisha. Yeah.
Anyway, I was also thinking I have a grandchild who is a fantasy reader and everything, and all the books I think thus far she's read, like she did not have Black. I think maybe one last set she had. They finally where I saw where the characters were Black and everything. So when you were saying that, it's like, hey, Ray would love this. This is right up her alley.
Yay.
I can see, looking at you, I can see Ray reading that book and everything. So, hey, I really appreciate it. I'm thinking she's going to get that for her birthday.
Thank you.
I appreciate that. And then your whole thing again also about names. They have names like Sanaa, there's Layla, there's Ari, and yes. So I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
My children have very Anglo names.
Sometimes you get tired. My parents gave me Ayana, then they gave my brother and sister extremely English names. They were just like, we're gonna try it with the oldest and then revert right back.
I just want to say, my dad wrote a science fiction novel, and it was published in the 70s, and that was, nobody knew what anybody looked like, and his main character was Black, and he walked in to the office, and they were like, oh, you're white. My question is, how do you feel about people of different colors, or different abilities, or different diversities, writing about people that are not their same color, diversity?
Yeah. So this is a shameless plug, I guess. I have a class that I taught about writing outside of your lived experience. It's with a group called the Writers Conservatory where I talk about it. I am not one of those people that's like, oh, well, you're not Black, or you're not Asian, or you're not, so you can't do that. I don't believe in a lot of can'ts when it comes to writing. Some of the best books we've seen in the world were written by people who stepped out of their lived experience, and so I don't believe in that. But I think instead of saying, well, am I allowed to do that? It's more of, well, why am I doing that? And also, what work am I prepared to do to make sure I get this right? Do I understand the responsibility behind it? And am I prepared to take critique and feedback from the community that I'm borrowing from or that I'm writing about? And if you say, well, I don't want feedback, stop and ask yourself, am I the right person? Or if you're not interested in doing that research and that work, maybe that's not what you need to do right now. I'm more interested in like the deeper questions there instead of saying, well, are you allowed to do that? I know there's a lot of discussion and people get canceled, and I think we miss out on a lot of great stories because people write from fear, and I don't think you should write from fear. Yeah. Thank you for asking that.
So we'll take one more question, and then we'll open up for book signing. I know you've been waiting.
I was curious as to how long the writing process usually is for you, because I know you're saying you're thinking about 26, 27. So from start to finish, how long does it normally take you to?
I started Beasts of Prey right when I graduated from college in May 2015. I finished the first draft in May of 2019, so 4 years. I'm not allowed to do that anymore. So I took my time, and I was learning how to tell. Beast of Prey is the first story I've ever written. I don't think I said it's the first full book I've ever written. Like I would start and then I would give up, and I would start and I'd give up. So that was the first full story I wrote, and I was learning. Now I can do a book a year, roughly, if I'm not doing too much, like if I don't tour, if I don't travel or teach, whatever. This year I did 1.5 books in a year, which surprised me, but I think it's because I wasn't traveling and I was mostly at home with my puppies and just relaxing and not putting that pressure on myself to go fast. And you have to find the pace that, like, I know some authors that do a book every 2 years. I know some authors, this author, Nora Roberts, maybe you've heard of her. She writes 4 books a year, but she talks about how she does that. And also her books are not tomes that are 400 pages. She's writing like smaller romance novels, and she's able to put out, because she's nailed her process down, and she's been writing for like 40 years. She knows her process, so she can do 4 books a year. At this moment, I'm comfortable with a book a year, and it's not like January I start, December I finish. It's like, if I started in November of last year, I'm wrapping up by maybe August, September of this year. So roughly, but it just depends. Some books have given me more trouble than others. My 4th book was the easiest book I've written so far.
All right, well, thank you for coming once
thank
again.
you.
Pyramids in the back.
That was so good.
You make it.